Good evening, everybody. Here's a bit of karma. I live in the Washington, D.C. area in Maryland, just a mile over the D.C. line. But tonight, I happen to be in London. So, this American will try her hand at recounting and observing a bit of British life as presented in chapters 40 to 42. In page count, these chapters begin the second half of the book. I was reflecting on Katie's wonderful intro last month, in which she described what many of us felt at the time, that this novel started slowly and laden with details. It did pick up, of course, but as with many of Trollope's novels, we spent several chapters getting to know the family trees, the literal lay of the land, and becoming intimate with the personalities, longings, and indeed sometimes puzzles of the people. In every Trollope novel I've read, there's a point in the story where I become hooked and I want to clear the calendar and read continuously nonstop to the end. And this section was that point for me. We're now immersed in our story. To move the plot along, these chapters are filled with external and internal arrangements, those to be, those not to be, and those which are turned on their head at the last minute. And the theme of class is laden throughout. I'll first review the development of the two marriage plots in the story, and then we'll check in with our American senator. We last left Arabella in the arms of Lord Rufford, returning to Mistletoe in the hired post-chaise with a sorta, but not really, marriage proposal. So we begin this section with a fantastic description of the following day and how both Arabella and Lord Rufford are each engaged in their own internal thoughts of what happened and how to proceed. Perhaps it is these internal arrangements of the characters that make them seem so intimate to us, and one of the reasons we love our authors so much. Both Arabella and Lord Rufford spend time in chapter 40 thinking to themselves. Arabella plans who she will say what to when, knowing the stakes are high for a big reward, and if she fails, it will be a long drop, perhaps even to the bottom of the Patagonia Sea. Lord Rufford, for a moment anyway, considers whether he should take the idea of a possible marriage seriously. After his behavior the previous evening, perhaps he owed it to Arabella to at least consider this. But alas, he falls asleep and then must dress for dinner, putting off the decision. Trollope tells us this from Rufford's point of view, although can't you feel the author's wink and nod between the lines? Arabella boldly tells her aunt, the Duchess, that they are indeed engaged, and her aunt is quite dubious that Arabella is telling the truth. For good reason, of course. But the Duchess plays along on the odd chance that this unlikely but fortunate match might be made. With Arabella's urging, her aunt gets the Duke to agree to talk to Lord Rufford about this, as long as the Duchess herself can arrange the meeting. Arabella is really hedging her bets here. The scandalous return of Arabella and Lord Rufford together in a hired post-chaise on the previous evening is, of course, known throughout the guests at Mistletoe. But no one really believes a match will be made. In fact, our dear old friend, the Duchess of Omnium, says that Lord Rufford is about the silliest man of his day, but there is one thing which I do not think even he is silly enough to do. Trollope tells us that while the Lord may be foolish, the Duchess of Omnium was mistaken in calling him silly. After dinner, in a reverse hunt, Lord Rufford avoids Arabella's aunt as skillfully as he would pursue a fox. He knows what trap that Duchess has in mind. Lord Rufford makes his own arrangements to leave Mistletoe at the crack of dawn to see a horse at Stamford, thus avoiding a meeting with the Duke and a possible next step toward an actual proposal. Arabella is disappointed, but not really surprised by this early departure. Ever the schemer, she carries on in front of her aunt and the others as if this was of no significance, and decides to write one letter of an almost teasing, buoyant nature to Lord Rufford, stating that a more serious letter will follow. She lets her aunt know that she will post this at Mistletoe, thinking that her aunt will read the letter behind her back, and thus composes it with this in mind. Trollope says that although Arabella contrived, his word, this arrangement, the Duchess would have considered herself disgraced if she had ever done such a thing. But the niece of the Duchess did not quite understand that this would be so. In this way, Trollope is again alluding to Arabella's character. Some readers may say she is a shameless schemer, but others see that she has no choice. She is fighting for her social life here and must be clever, creative, and gutsy to reach her goal. Arabella continues to plot the steps to make this long shot of an actual proposal happen. She sends Lord Rufford the follow up serious letter asking for confirmation of the proposal, and it is a letter Lord Rufford will not be able to ignore. Arabella knows in all likelihood she will need the men in her family to intercede, and she is prepared to involve her very uninvolved father, as well as her cousin, Lord Mistletoe. And what is going on in Lord Rufford's mind as Arabella is in quest of his firm proposal? He receives Arabella's two letters simultaneously and knows he can no longer avoid her by running to see horses, and he now stops pretending that he even has a decision to be made. It is clear to him, our author writes, that he would under no circumstances marry Arabella Trefoil. He was being hunted and run down, and with the instinct of all animals that are hunted, he prepares himself to escape. However, this is a tricky situation, and Trollope continues with Lord Rufford's thoughts. It might be said, no doubt would be said, that he behaved badly. That would be said because it would not be open to him to tell the truth. And he goes on to lament that the lady can tell her story with exaggeration, but the man can never do so. He remembers in the carriage from Peltry when she asked him whether he loved her, and he said he did and would do anything to make her happy. And then asked himself, was a man to be bound to marry a girl because of such a scene as that? Lord Rufford. But he has an upcoming hunt to plan and is more concerned with composing the party for that occasion than composing his letter to Arabella. He tells the whole story to his sister's husband with a piece of revisionist history, saying that all that has passed between them, and I quote, a fainting fit in a carriage and half a dozen kisses. Sir George undertakes to write the reply that Lord Rufford will send above his own good name. Regarding the more pressing makeup of the shooting party, they are short one man, and Lord Rufford takes up the suggestion to invite the forlorn lover from our other marriage story, Larry Twentyman. The letter Lord Rufford sends in Sir George's words is curt and to the point, saying, if I have said a word which has intentionally on my part given rise to such an idea, I can only beg your pardon heartily. But Trollope is not letting the Lord off the hook quite so easily. While he may be refusing Arabella, our author does remind us of how Lord Rufford led Arabella on, including promising to make her a gift of Jack the horse, which, as Sir George implies, would be taken to mean a proposal is forthcoming. Nevertheless, the cold and definitive letter is sent. When Arabella receives this letter, she is determined to have her father respond. In an echo of Sir George writing the letter that Lord Rufford signed on his own, Arabella writes the letter for her father to copy in his own hand and sign. Augustus Trefoil can hardly be pulled from the whist room at his club, but Arabella convinces him that he must defend her honor. Arabella's own version, reflected in this letter, of course, was that marriage was indeed proposed by Lord Rufford, with demands to know what excuse he has to repudiate the offer. Arabella knows not to trust this do-or-die task solely to her father and tries to enlist her cousin, Lord Mistletoe. But Lord Mistletoe, while acknowledging that Arabella may have been treated badly, refuses to be drawn into the affair. He claims that the court of public opinion will condemn Rufford, but that, quote, in these days one can't make a man marry. While Arabella was stewing to herself about what she deemed to be her cousin's cowardice and planning her next move, her arrangements take an unexpected twist as she receives a short letter from John Morton stating that he is quite ill and that Arabella and her mother may want to see him at Bracton. The other marriage plot of this novel, the one involving Mary Masters, has a shorter and less complex, Trollope may say less contrived, journey than Arabella and Lord Rufford, although it also involves an unexpected arrangement that leads to John Morton's sickbed at Bracton. But let's go back a bit. Although Mary Masters has made it clear in her letter to Larry Twentyman that she cannot marry him, Mrs. Masters will not accept this and quarrels terribly with Mary, calling her a moping slut. Mr. Masters, in a rare direct reproach to his wife, says that he will not have Mary persecuted. Nevertheless, Mary decides she cannot live under these conditions, and remembering Lady Ushant's offer of a home and the old lady's assurances that such an arrangement would be very comfortable, she writes to Lady Ushant with her father's consent, and the two agree not to tell Mrs. Masters. Interestingly, upon receipt of the letter, Lady Ushant is not quite sure how to respond. She recognizes the advantage of leaving Mary in her father's home to be influenced to accept Mr. Twentyman. On the other hand, she has a hunch about Mary's fondness for Reginald, and though she would relish such a match, she wonders if Reginald would ever marry. As such, she writes to Reginald asking him to visit the Masters and arrange the thing himself, as he sees fit. When Reginald goes to see the Masters at his aunt's request, he finds only Mrs. Masters at home. Given the subject matter is Ushanting, no good can come of this meeting. Mrs. Masters declares it cannot be arranged. Nothing of the kind can be arranged. You can just picture her stamping her foot. Mrs. Masters explains to Reginald that Mary is pig-headed and obstinate, and that she must earn her own bread one way or another rather than thinking of herself as a fine lady. When Reginald does see Mary, he conveys that Lady Ushant would be delighted to have Mary stay with her. This leads Mrs. Masters to much anger, and Mary blames herself for the tension in the house and is mortified that Reginald has witnessed her stepmother's rage. But among all this anger, it was nonetheless arranged that Reginald was to accompany Mary to Cheltenham to spend 6 months with Lady Ushant. But as Trollope named the last chapter of today's section, Providence interferes. Word has arrived at the Master's household that Lady Ushant would postpone Mary's visit because she herself has been summoned to Bragton. Lady Ushant's grandnephew George Morton and the head of the family had expressed a desire to see her. Of course, she writes that she will see Mary at Bragton, but Mrs. Masters was lost in glee at the thought that this could reawaken Larry Twentyman's chances. Through the twists and turns of these arrangements, moving the marriage plots forward, there are a couple of interludes to hear from our friend, the American senator. We see the senator's observations and opinions of the British class system in 4 settings. First, Mr. Gotobed's involvement with the land use case of Gourley against Lord Rufford, which to him was a matter of high principle, the lowly farmer Gourley against the great lord. But he learns that Gourley has settled the case with the lord and finds himself subject to a monetary dispute with Gourley's attorney, Mr. Bearside. With threats of being sued himself, poor Mr. Gotobed settles the account. What are we to make of all this? John Morton says to his friend, and I quote, "I'm sorry you should be troubled, Mr. Gotobed, but upon my word, I cannot say but what it serves you right." And Gotobed answers, "That is because you are offended with me. I endeavor to protect a poor man against a rich man, and that in this country is a cause for offense." Speaking of a cause for offense, this leads us to the second scene of the senator pining on British life, this time that of church patronage. The senator and John Morton join some other men of Dillsborough for a dinner at the home of the rector, Mr. Mainwaring. The senator, in a direct affront to his host, turns to church patronage and says, this is another quote, "A general can't make his son a colonel at the age of 25, or an admiral his son a first lieutenant, or a judge a queen's counselor, nor can the head of an office promote his to be a chief secretary. It is only a bishop can do this, I suppose, because a cure of souls is so much less important than the charge of a ship or the discipline of 20 or 30 clerks." The senator's tone and content is insulting. Is Trollope here commenting on an American style? Yet we can't help thinking that some of these opinions are really the author's own. The conversation takes a steady turn downhill as the senator and the rector seem to talk past each other. And this is on top of the senator's ungracious comments on the rector's prized claret, which the rector took in stride while thinking how no one could ever get a good glass of wine in the United States. Still, he was sorry that he wasted a bottle of his prized claret on these guests that evening. Thirdly, much of this is summed up in the senator's second letter to his friend back in Washington. In an earlier section, we had the first letter to that same correspondent, a congressman from his home state. We are well aware of the senator's angle of his observations of the English. So rather than sum up the contents of the letter, we can get more insight into our titular character, as is often the case with Trollope, from a peek into the senator's internal musings. Trollope writes of the senator, quote, everything he heard and almost everything he saw offended him at some point. And yet, in the midst of it all, he was conscious that he was surrounded by people who claimed and made good their claims to superiority. What was a lord, let him be ever so rich and have ever so many titles? And yet, even with such a popinjay as Lord Rufford, he himself felt the lordship. When that old farmer at the hunt breakfast had removed himself and his belongings to the other side of the table, the senator, although aware of the justice of his own cause, had been keenly alive to the rebuke. He had expressed himself very boldly at the rector's house at Dillsborough and had been certain that not a word of real argument had been possible answer to him. But yet he left the house with a feeling of almost shame, which had grown in real penitence before he reached Bragton. Trollope further tells us that the senator was aware that he himself was perceived as ill-mannered and absurd, yet he had a purpose and would follow this through to deliver somewhere in London a lecture on his sharp observations on British society. Finally, the senator is able to observe a session of Parliament and seems utterly perplexed, as was this reader, by the difference of suffrage in the towns and counties. I do, however, need to quote this line on suffrage from the senator's letter, as it is uncannily relevant. The senator writes, the divisions, I am assured, were made to suit the aspirations of political magnates when the first reform bill was passed. What is to be expected of a country in which such absurdities are loved and sheltered? This, of course, could be right out of yesterday's opinion page of the Washington Post. One final quick word here on the great chapter describing the dinner at the Bush and illustrating some of the subtle and not so subtle roles of character and class. We remember that Larry Twentyman had been invited to join Lord Rufford's hunt, and thus the dinner with Rufford and his party. What an honor this was to Larry, and that the innkeeper Runciman would witness Larry in this way, all chummy with Lord Rufford. As Larry becomes more comfortable with with some champagne, he and Rufford discuss Larry's plans to sell Chowton Farm, and Rufford tells Larry he'll be missed in the hunt. Larry replies that it is kind of the Lord to say this, but, quote, there are things which may make a man about a young woman. And here's a final quote. You should never let those troubles touch you so closely, said his lordship, whose own withers at this moment were by no means unwrung. In a footnote to the Oxford edition, it is explained that Trollope is paraphrasing Hamlet here, meaning that he, Lord Rufford, had not entirely escaped either. Thank you.